The storm hit like a freight train barreling down from the Smokies, ripping the backpack from my shoulders and hurling it into the abyss below the ridge. I lunged after it, fingers scraping wet granite. My scream swallowed by the gale as lightning cracked open the sky like God's own judgment. In that split second, before the void could claim me, a hand, strong, calloused, unyielding, locked around my wrist and yanked me back from the edge, our eyes meeting in a flash of thunderlit terror that bound us tighter than any rope ever could. My name's Emmanuel, and up until that moment on the Appalachian Trail, I'd been running from more than just bad weather. I ditched the corporate grind in Atlanta 6 months earlier. Some soul-sucking marketing gig where I managed teams that hated me and a boss who saw my quiet ambition as a threat. Leadership? Yeah, right. I'd flunked it at every turn. Promotions lost to louder voices. Friendships frayed by my inability to speak up. So I packed a rucksack and hit the trail, chasing solitude in the green veins of America's backbone. The @ was supposed to be my reset button. 30 miles from Springer Mountain. Just me, the mud, and the ghosts of better men who'd conquered worse. That's when I met Micah. He appeared out of the fog like an apparition from a Hemingway novel, broad-shouldered and weathered, his flannel shirt clinging to a frame honed by years of wrangling chaos. Mid-30s, maybe, with salt and pepper stubble that framed a jaw set like the granite we scrambled over. He was crouched under a dripping overhang, fiddling with a battered compass, when the heavens unleashed. Our paths crossed at a shelter just before the deluge. Me stumbling and soaked and cursing. Him offering a nod and a spare protein bar without a word. "Emmanuel," I said, extending a hand that felt too small in his grip. "Micah," he replied, his voice low and steady, laced with that easy southern drawl that masked depths I couldn't yet fathom. Virginia boy, he told me later, raised on tales of Civil War ghosts and the unyielding pulse of the Blue Ridge. We didn't plan to hike together. Hell, I barely trusted my own feet that first day, let alone a stranger's company. But the trail has a way of forging alliances in the marrow. By dawn, as the rain tapered to a spiteful drizzle, Micah was there with coffee brewed over a smokeless fire, his eyes scanning the horizon like he owned it. "You lead today," he said, slapping my shoulder with a grin that crinkled the corners of his hazel eyes. "Led?" The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Back home, leading meant boardrooms and bullshit metrics. Out here it was navigating switchbacks blind through laurel thickets, deciding when to ford a swollen creek that could sweep you under. Micah became my unwilling mentor that week, though he'd scoff at the label. He was a high school history teacher from Richmond, the kind who turned dusty textbooks into battle cries, inspiring kids from broken homes to see themselves as the heroes of their own revolutions. "Divorced? No kids," he said flatly one evening as we shared jerky by the firelight. His ex couldn't handle the hours he poured into fixing other people's messes. There was a shadow in his voice then, a flicker of something raw, but he waved it off with a laugh. "Leadership ain't about crowns, Emmanuel. It's about carrying the weight when no one's watching." We fell into a rhythm, me out front second-guessing every route and rockfall, him trailing with quiet corrections that felt less like critique and more like lifelines. "Eyes up," he'd murmur when doubt crept in, his hand brushing my elbow just long enough to steady me. There was electricity in those touches, subtle, unspoken, the kind that simmers under flannel and fear. I'd catch myself stealing glances, the way sweat traced the curve of his neck, or how his laugh boomed like thunder echoing off the valley walls. At night, in the close quarters of trail shelters, our sleeping bags side by side, I'd lie awake listening to his breathing, wondering if he felt it too. This pull, magnetic and terrifying, like gravity testing its hold. By day 4, we'd crested Klingman's Dome, the highest point on the where the world unspools in a haze of purple ridges and the faint hum of civilization far below. We sat on a weathered bench, backs against the observation tower, passing a thermos of trail whiskey he'd stashed in his pack. "Tell me about the man who couldn't lead," Micah prompted, his knee knocking mine in that accidental on purpose way. So I did. Spilled it all. The promotion I botched by staying silent in a meeting. The friend I lost to my own cowardice when he came out and I froze like a deer in headlights. "I'm gay," I admitted, the words tumbling out like rocks from a scree field. "But owning it? That's the real summit I can't climb." Micah didn't flinch. He just nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. Takes one to know one, brother. Been out since I was 16. Fought tooth and nail for it in a town that'd sooner stone you than celebrate. His hand found mine then, thumb tracing a slow circle on my knuckles. It wasn't pity. It was permission. In that moment, with the wind whispering secrets through the spruce, I felt seen. Not as a failure, but as a force. The romance bloomed slow, like spring in the hollows. Stolen stories under star-pricked skies, his fingers lingering when he adjusted my pack straps. The way he'd hum old folk tunes, Dylan, Cash, to drown out my doubts. We talked leadership like it was scripture. How Lincoln held the Union with letters stained by his own tears. How everyday folks in Selma marched not for glory but for ghosts yet unborn. Micah taught me to read the land as a lesson. Rivers carving canyons through sheer will, oaks standing sentinel after lightning strikes. You're the river, Emmanuel, he'd say, his voice gravelly with conviction. Not the obstacle. And damn if it didn't start to sink in. I took point on tougher sections, calling shots on detours around washouts, even rallying us through a midnight bear scare with a whoop and a flung rock that sent the Bruin hightailing. But the wild doesn't yield its lessons without teeth. The betrayal came on day 7, as we pushed toward the Nantahala River, thunderheads building like old grudges on the skyline. I'd noticed Micah's silences deepening, his compass checks turning obsessive, like he was mapping an escape. That night, huddled in a lean-to as drizzle pattered the tin roof, he pulled out his phone. First time I'd seen it since we started. No signal, but the photos glowed, him beaming in a tux, arm around a woman in white, their faces alight with promise. Ex-wife, he muttered when I glanced over, but his eyes darted away. The next morning, over oatmeal mush, he confessed in fragments. The divorce wasn't just burnout. She'd found letters. Pages he'd written to a man from his past. A college flame he'd buried under vows and denial. I thought I could outrun it, he said, voice cracking like dry twigs. Be the straight arrow teacher, the mentor without cracks. But you make me want to lead for real. For us. It gutted me. Not the secret. He'd carried enough shame for a lifetime. But the lie of omission. The way he'd mirrored my vulnerabilities while hiding his own fractures. You think I'm some project? I shot back, heat rising like fever. Teaching me to stand tall while you're still crouched in the closet? The words hung heavy, sharper than any switchblade. He reached for me, but I recoiled, storming into the mist-choked woods alone. Hours blurred. Roots snagging my boots, regret gnawing deeper than hunger. Leadership, he'd said, was carrying the weight. But whose weight? Mine, or the one we'd both been lugging since boys? Society's boot on our necks, whispering we weren't enough. Suspense coiled as the sky darkened. Wind howling warnings I ignored. I pushed higher, toward a false summit I'd spotted on the map, chasing clarity in the chaos. The ridge narrowed to a knife edge, slick with lichen and lies, when the gale hit full force. One misstep, that's all it took. My foot slipped on loose shale, body pitching sideways into the sheer drop. Time fractured. The world tilting. My pack's weight yanking me down. A guttural no, tearing from my throat. Then him. Micah, bursting from the tree lean like a force of nature, diving across the gap to seize my wrist. His boots skidded, nails of his free hand gouging stone for purchase, veins bulging in his neck as he hauled against gravity. Lightning forked above, illuminating the raw plea in his eyes. Not mentor to pupil, but man to man, equals in the storm. We collapsed together on safer ground, chests heaving, rain mingling with the blood trickling from a gash on his brow where he'd clipped a branch in his rush. No words at first, just the press of his forehead to mine, breaths sinking in ragged harmony. I betrayed you, he whispered finally, voice muffled against my collar. Not with secrets, but by fearing them. You showed me how to lead by being brave enough to break first. Tears cut tracks through the mud on his face, and I saw it then. The humanism in us both, flawed vessels carrying light despite the leaks. I cupped his jaw, thumb brushing the salt of his skin. We both did, but the trail doesn't end at the fall. It loops back, wiser. We limped down together as dawn bled gold over the valleys, the crisis forging something unbreakable. No grand declarations, No rings exchanged under rhododendrons. Just a quiet pact, sealed with intertwined fingers as we crossed the river at last. Micah headed back to Richmond to out himself fully, not just to his school, but to the kids who'd one day need a map through their own wilds. Me? I returned to Atlanta, not as the silent marketer, but as a voice. Pitching ideas that stuck, mentoring juniors with the grit I'd gleaned from Granite and Gales. We talk weekly, late-night calls laced with plans for the Pacific Crest, promises of trails untrod. Leadership, I learned, isn't a solo summit. It's the hand in the dark, the betrayal that bears your bones, the love that rises from the wreckage. In the wild heart of America, Micah and I found ours. Not in conquering peaks, but in choosing each other every slippery step of the way. And damn if that doesn't make the view from here feel infinite.